It is a very exciting find out of the latest Human Development Report. Tell me how you and your colleagues have been preparing for this, and what do you think people should take away as the key message?
After the pandemic, for the first time now in 2023, we saw globally the Human Development Index recover. And that is good news. It shows that people, economies, societies, markets are recovering. But two very red flashing lights also in this year's Human Development Report. One pointing to an uneven and partial recovery, because particularly for poorer countries, least developed countries, low-income countries, that recovery is not happening. They are trapped in a post-pandemic, both financial and economic crisis, but also the inability to invest in the future. And that is an element of this year's report, also a very close look at the increasing polarization we are seeing. Within countries, because of inequality, insecurity, we see a growing fracture in the political discourse, in many societies, radicalization, but also, and this is also concerning at the global and international level, because the report repeatedly points to the fact that the world is bound to cooperate to address the great challenges of our time, and yet we seem to be seeing more and more tensions, geopolitical, but also more and more conflicts and crises, and this is affecting human development across the globe.
But what could be the solution to fix it?
The ability to cooperate internationally is a precondition for success, whether it is climate change, preparing for the next pandemic, whether it is the digital revolution and artificial intelligence. All of these are developments that require countries to work together. And this is why in the United Nations, but also in the Human Development Report, we are pointing towards a number of areas where we need to recognize that there are global public goods, and whether they are the climate-related ones, whether they are the digital public goods, or whether they're also the ability to bring more financing and investment, particularly to poorer developing economies. This is a crucial variable, because what we also observe and highlight is that post-pandemic, many countries have exhausted their fiscal space. They are deeply indebted, and many countries are now paying more in interest to service their debt than they're able to invest in their education or health sector, never mind in a cleaner energy infrastructure or a digital public infrastructure.
You see some of the emerging economies, developing countries, China included, trying to work on that. But now, with a fragmented world, many issues very hard to push forward. There were also setbacks. So from your perspective, how is the backdrop of geopolitics providing all these complexities? Do you think, as an organization of yours, aiming at development, could be doing something at least to begin with?
Two things are particularly concerning. First of all, we have more conflicts in the world in 2023 than at any point since the Second World War.
Yeah.
And that also explains we have well over 100 million refugees, internally displaced peoples. Economies are essentially being driven backwards. Take a country like Yemen, take a country like Ukraine, like Afghanistan. The loss in human development there is sometimes measured literally in decades lost. And this is one area in which clearly it is very difficult for the UN to simply step into a conflict. It requires a great deal of international cooperation. We are seeing that eroded because of the geopolitical tensions, whether it's in the Security Council, whether it is in the General Assembly. In that sense, the UN is a mirror image of where the world finds itself right now, disrupted with a lot of tensions. At the same time, what we also see is that domestic policies and how governments responded to the pandemic, how they're investing in addressing inequality, how they're addressing, for example, decarbonization, the investment in digital access, affordable access, can also fundamentally change the trajectory of a country's development path. And this is why the report is not only describing the challenges and crises, it is actually focused on the opportunities that are there. But it is a world that at the moment is not seizing them. On the contrary, it seems to be drifting apart, and we are losing our ability to actually tackle these issues.
You have seen what we are facing today, one challenge after another. Where you are sitting would know more even than I do about that. Do you feel frustrated? How early was the frustration, and now how do you digest these frustrations and turn them into energies to focus on actions that can change at least a bit by bit?
Well, let's start with a very simple human phenomenon. There is a lot of misperception and a lot of misinformation in the world today. The Human Development Report has a very interesting illustration when people were interviewed across the world and asked, how much would you be willing to invest yourself of your own money in addressing climate change? 70% of the respondents said, I would be willing to do that. When you ask the same group of people, what do you think others would be willing to do? They said, well, maybe 40% would be doing or willing to do something. And here you have a classic example where people will not act because they think others will not act. We have to address a lot of misperception, misinformation. We have to also get people's confidence and also understanding that in this day and age, for example, with climate change, nations are bound to work together. We cannot succeed alone. And that is why, for example, the investments in decarbonization, renewable energy are so vital. And this is particularly where wealthier countries must also step in to assist poorer countries to make that transition. We have a global energy economy. We have a global food economy. We are bound to, in a sense, drive that global economy together, or it will create a lot of disruptions. And this is partly where I think there is a lot of reasons to be frustrated, but let us also acknowledge on the renewable energy front, we just saw in 2023 a record year of investment, China playing a very critical and central role here. $1.8 billion invested in new clean energy infrastructure, but only 2 to 3% of that investment actually landed on the continent of Africa, where the need for energy and access to electricity is perhaps the greatest in the world today.
One thing is we have seen some interesting development, some positive ones. For example, the UN resolution on AI governance and also the latest UN resolution on Gaza ceasefire. But many wonder whether this is just the cream on top, whether these resolutions will easily evaporate away.
The first thing we have to tackle, however, is a concentration in particularly in corporate terms of access and control of technology and markets. For instance, few people realize that the 3 top tech companies in the world individually each were larger than 90% of the countries with their GDP. So you can see an extraordinary concentration. Secondly, we have very few guardrails on the deployment of a technology that could fundamentally affect people, societies, public information, and also leave behind billions of people if we don't drive this development in a way that is inclusive. So I think the fact that countries have come together in the United Nations at this moment to put forward a resolution on artificial intelligence is a good sign. And frankly, we have seen a number of very positive developments, for instance, also in the Kunming Montreal Biodiversity Framework, when China presided over the Convention on Biological Diversity last year, a groundbreaking agreement was reached. The world can collaborate, but it must look for ways in which to overcome the tensions and differences. And I think particularly when it comes to new technologies, we have to make sure that we are together as a world community, as a community of nations, because otherwise these technologies could lead to extraordinary inequalities, leaving billions of people behind, and that is no viable way forward.
From a human development report's perspective, how do you see the growth of artificial intelligence? On the one hand, what are the policies to encourage technology to benefit more people? On the other hand, the AI governance, how that balance is being ticked right now. Are you satisfied with that?
I think no one can be satisfied with where we are at the moment, but that is in part because it is a very new and very disruptive technology, but one that is almost without precedent in the way that it will change the ability of humans, of nations, of economies to do things. So it carries with it enormous opportunity, but also enormous risks. Every technology can be weaponized, cyber crime, cyber warfare. We see these risks and dangers, and we need to be precautionary. We need to also have a preventive approach, because otherwise we will drift into a situation where technologies become, in a sense, instruments for a geopolitical competition, and that could be very dangerous for the world. At the same time, we know that AI is projected to, create access to opportunities, whether data-based or in terms of market, employment, livelihoods, that are in many ways extremely promising. And our focus in UNDP is particularly to help developing and least developed countries to be able to right now invest in their digital public infrastructure. That is the foundation of how an economy can participate in this enormously rapid changing environment. So extraordinary opportunities, but without guardrails, without international cooperation, could also very quickly turn into an exclusionary technology, and even one that could be weaponized.